Then I will open the floor to questions. Folks can speak up if they do their mind up. No?
First of all, thank you very much. It's really interesting. I'm not going to make the mistake of guessing how Arendt's work's being used today, although I'm interested in that.
I'd love to, yeah.
And you pushed us to think the other way around. But I want to, so first of all, let me say that the marginal or the reading of Arendt that you gave that focuses on revolutionary violence is one that I think makes total sense, and you're absolutely right. And Arendt praises violence many times, especially when it's collective. Of course, then it becomes not violence so much as power.
Right.
And so, in fact, one of her main points in On Revolution is that the genius of the American Revolution in her mind, as American-centric as that is that it didn't shy away from power. It created a constitutional system that created multiple power sources instead of one sovereign power source. So well, that's just a preface to say I think she is not against power, and she's not against violence when it's collective. But I wanted to, you can respond to that. The question I have is actually around your interesting comparison with the Hungarian Revolution. She writes the preface, the epilogue to the second edition of Origins of Totalitarianism, published in 1958.
Before it was taken out.
And then it was taken out. And it's not in any of the other future editions. And there's always been some question of why she took it out. It's never republished in any of her work. Interestingly enough, Christopher Hitchens, I don't know if you've read his piece on this.
He has somewhere too.
But he spoke at the first Hannah Arendt Center conference we ever had. And he made an incredibly provocative and interesting thesis about, and he asked the question, he asked the question, why does she disavow the Hungarian Revolution epilogue?
It's got Suez in the title as well, this piece, right?
Yes.
There's a connection between Suez and...
Yes. And his answer is that shortly after she writes the epilogue and publishes it, she becomes painfully aware of the anti-Semitic nature of much of the Hungarian Revolution. And that even though she respected and loved revolutionary aspects of the Hungarian Revolution, she could no longer celebrate the Hungarian Revolution to the extent she had. When we compare that with Arab-Palestinian questions as well, and what we can learn from Arendt, and the spontaneity involved in much of this, I'm just wondering how that does or doesn't change our valence. It's one thing to praise spontaneity and power from the streets, and power which she would praise, but there's also a worry about its let's call it the illiberal and non-human aspects of the potential of violence from below. And so I'm just wondering how that changes your willingness or the way you want to think about her use of the epilogue.
It's actually highly topical, that entire question, because right now with the new government in Hungary, which is a right-wing and history rewriting regime, although it was at the back of my mind as I was writing this, I think there's a point precisely to be made that Arendt had this point, that there was a certain vision of Hungarian history, and particularly those 12 days, that I think is now in danger of being erased or nationalized, or So I thank you for that. So it's, I guess, the problem of revolution, spontaneity, and violence is always at what point does a revolution end, and which direction does it go? Hannah Arendt, I think, on the revolution was highly critical of what happens to what the founding fathers of the American Revolution created. And that it was sort of forgotten. It's a lost treasure, the whole trope of the lost treasure, whether it's the lost treasure of the Hungarian Revolution, the lost treasure of the American, or the Arab Revolution, as I'm kind of intimating. That's right. That's that wonderful quote that is in fact features both on Revolution, the last chapter, and it begins between past and future. So what ends this revolutionary, this productive energy? And it can either go into sort of gratuitous violence, or it goes the way of actually constitutionalism almost, or party system that then takes over. So what these councils and these spontaneous organizations have created, a new beginning, the lid is put on by elections. And this is a process that we do see also in Egypt. You could make that argument. And many of the activists who have nothing to share with Hannah and who have made this argument, we don't want these elections now or in this format because the Muslim Brotherhood is getting into power, not perhaps because they're more popular, but because they're more organized and they're going to claim this revolution from us. And there's all kinds of funny memes about that on the internet. So in the case of the Egyptian uprising, it was ended, and this is not me, this is what activists have said, it ended with the call for elections, with the referendum, with the election of Morsi. But it can also, of course, go into, I have the right example now, I don't think Palestine is the right example, but it can end in pogroms. I think that's pogroms, yes. That's the fear. I think that's why Arendt spends a good deal in once she's got on violence. Once she's gotten over the Black Panthers and the student uprisings in Germany, and she then the second chapter she basically separates out power, which is good, which is productive, which is emancipatory, which is empowering. Actually, it's almost she means it to be empowering, versus violence. And I am heartened that you should say I'm not that marginal in my interpretation. I got the sense that generally Arendt is received as being against violence, precisely because she sees violence as the ugly cousin of power. But
I mean, there are plenty of places she. I mean,
yeah,
depends
I
exactly
found
what you
them.
mean
I
by
found
violence.
them, but
But I mean,
was,
I've been in Jerusalem. I mean, she calls her to be killed.
yeah, she's no pacifist, of course. That's right. Yeah.
The kidnapping, right? Revolutionary violence, she certainly supports. And as you know, and there's that quote from On Violence where she says that sometimes you need violence.
Right.
To do justice. Politically, violence has no power. Legally,
yes, that's right.
Violence can have power, but they're separate. And so she always does, she's not opposed to violence in legal context or in other contexts. And she just doesn't think it has political
yes, that's right.
viability. Then it becomes
Yes,
power.
that's right. Then when it becomes routinized, you end up with a system like the onion, the pyramid, or
Yes.
the wolf. Right. Yeah.
Can I take us lowbrow?
Kill them.
I want to ask about the absent center at the top, right? Just the elementary question. How is she read, translated, thought vis-a-vis the uprising? Is there something to say there or not? I mean, I know there are lots of people writing in all kinds of forums like Jedaliah who are, you can go there every week and find a piece that says, essentially the goddamn stupid Western liberals get it wrong again, right? And, a new version of what that
Imperialist,
looks like.
the Atif Said wrote, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
That's the latest installation, yeah. Well, all for, not without cause, right? But, so I'm just curious,
Yeah. It's not systematic, and I don't want to, there's a small isthmus here. I do not want to import something that is not, as it were, organic. But where I do find it, in fact, is I do find Arendt more in the description of the authoritarianism of Mubarak, of SCAF, of the Brotherhood. So Arendt's work, it's not, it's episodical, but my sense is that it's more used against the powers that be, the violent nature of the regimes of Mubarak and since Mubarak. Not so much as a guide to how to mobilize. There, in fact, or even as a guide to violence. So, if you follow Jalalia, you have Philip Risk, who has this wonderful article on the necessity of violence. He's talking and mobilizing, and this is a trend I've discovered lately. Walter Benjamin, a critique of violence, is, I wouldn't say all the rage, but has at least in 3 or 4 different fora has come up to examine, well, here's the 18 days of Tahrir Square, here's our revolution, here's the kind of violence, the sexual harassment, the assassination in Tunis, grappling with that turn to violence. I don't find Arendt there. Of course, I also don't find Arendt in Syria when you have clandestine mobilizations. You do find Rosa Luxemburg is there. So, as a rule, I think the left, there's a Marxist literature, the activist literature is probably was circulating on Tahrir Square. I wasn't there, but I do know that Khaled Fahmy is building an archive of that time. So I wouldn't be surprised if I find Luxemburg or Fanon, clearly, all those who kind of the manifestos of revolution.
Sure.
Not Arendt, I don't think. Arendt is useful for, to label the Maspero massacre, for example. There's Mona Abaza wrote Criminality of Evil after the Maspero massacre. So she evokes Hannah Arendt after a violent sort of government crackdown on Copts who demonstrated in November 2011. So again, it's more to label the oppression, to name the oppression, to expose the oppression. That's when Arendt is used, I think.
She did do plenty of work on that.
No, absolutely. But you would have, I think you have to,
Interesting.
you won't find Arendt on the flags of next to Hoda Sharawi and these other sort of.
Nor should we.
Nor should we.
Would you say something about Arendt's idea of binationalism is the correct way
Yes.
for Palestine to go early
Yep.
on?
Yep.
And both as in terms of a theory of justice and in terms of a possible collaborative strategy then and now.
Absolutely. In fact, I've cut out this entire section. It's about Edward Said, Hannah Arendt, and the binational idea of Palestine. In many ways, the binationalism, her revival, rediscovery of Martin Buber and Judah Magnus, have a lot to do with how she traveled, or her thought travels via Edward Said to critical Israelis on the left, Amnon Ras Krakotkin, Eyal Sivan in many ways, Eyal Weizmann, Gabi Peterberg. Edith Zertal, of course, yes. Now, the idea that Palestine needs to be shared, and shared equally, today makes a lot of sense. You can get called anti-Semitic for saying it, but I will say that the right of return is not just an Israeli prerogative. But we should also consider, the other thing, in 1946, before the Anglo-American Committee, where Albert Horani also spoke, he represented the Arab side, one of the 4 Arabs who spoke at this committee, versus Buber, Smilansky, and Magnus, and the 4th person. So the Yehud was also a minority voice, of course. And you can say it took a lot of courage to have that position. But when I talk about it in my chapter, I end on Albert Harani's point, the student of Collingwood's that I started off with. And he said, well, I mean, he didn't put it as much, he was a very gentle person, but basically he said, Julius Magnus's version or proposal is a binationalism that turns refugees into colonial settlers. And I must oppose it on those grounds. What I propose is a single democratic state in which Jews and Christians and Muslims share. Binationalism leads to partition. Now, that was in 1946, even before the Nakba. I think what we should do two things. We should unearth and appreciate Hannah Arendt's position, as well as Buber's and others. But I would always make a point that why should even the binational idea that I think today is very valid with, I think two-state solution just doesn't work for the Palestinians for all kinds of reasons of Bantu standardization. But I think we should also appreciate that the reluctance and resistance to even a considerate binational idea is a valid one in 1946. So I think, Arendt and the Yehud, I think it's an important chapter in this conflict that we should go back to. But I think it's not, I guess I'm afraid of monumentalizing Arendt's and Buber's binationalism. I think, we have to have the entire context and also give credence to the arguments, which were good arguments at the time, maybe not politic arguments, of Arabs who argued against it. But today, I think, and this is Simona Krakowski's argument, we need a kind of, that's why he and Zertal find Arendt so useful, because, it's perhaps one more kind of nuance to this. Today, generally we have a one-state solution and a two-state solution. That's kind of the way it's pitted. Binationalism is a way that could work in both scenarios. It's in a way, it's productive because it doesn't lock the debate in either or. Because you can have a binationalism where you have two states. The main point, and this is what Krakowski argues, is that whatever the borders are, they have to be porous. You cannot have a binationalism with walls, as high as the Chinese wall, and that are being constructed. It's in other words, it's secondary whether we want one state or two states, as long as there is an equality of access and neighborly relations. And I think that's why binationalism is more productive. It doesn't lock us in one or two states in this debate. I don't know if that fully answers your question. I think
Actually,
too
no,
much.
that's
Right.
That's helpful. I'm curious about what's happening actually in the region right now with respect to this concept.
Yeah, it's
If anything.
yeah. There's another argument that there are people who want to make alliances between West Bank settlers, Israeli settlers, and Palestinians. Yehuda Shinhav has made this argument that basically the settlers aren't the problem. It's a sort of an Ashkenazi sort of conspiracy that sells the settlers down the river in a two-state solution, when really settlers and West Bank Palestinians are one, should be one. That's, it's a new book, it's called Beyond the Two-State Solution. It's a very good book because it has Lama Amorude's introduction. And she says, well, for whom is this one-state solution good? For the settlers, not necessarily for the Palestinians. But there's a lot of, I think, the one good thing that has happened, and perhaps the mobilization of Arendt has contributed to it, is that it's an open field now. We can talk about a one-state solution without being ostracized or criminalized. And I think Arendt can take some posthumous credit for that.
Can I add just a historical footnote to the, because when she writes an essay around 1946, which is in a book called Zionism Reconsidered, and I think part of the impetus for her essay in there and her kind of interest in binationalism also comes out of a revulsion of the anti-British campaign that's being waged by the Irgun and the Stern gang, right? So she looks at the kind of rising power of the right-wing forces inside Zionism, and she thinks, well, if this is going to be the shape of the Jewish state, this isn't really something that I want to sign that I want to endorse.
No, I think she signed with Einstein. She signed this petition in the New York Times when Begin, was it Begin visited? Yeah, I think so.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
She argues that moving from the Jewish homeland rather than the Jewish state or nation.
Yeah.
I don't quite know what that means in her thinking at the time. In fact, I don't know at all.
It's, I mean, there's a long tradition of Jewish thought, not so long, but I think a long Zionist tradition, the road not taken, if you will, that is associated with Asher Ginsburg, Ahan Tam, who was one of the first Zionists who actually went in 1891 to Palestine and saw, well, there are Palestinians there. So to settle this land will have an impact on those settlers. And so, I mean, a lot of people sort of think Ha'am has the solution. So he's sort of a mythical figure now that we all kind of go back to say that, there's some, and I drew in my Kafka and Arabs piece, to say that there was a time when Zionism, in fact, was not destined to become a settler colonial project, that it did, but that, when it was conceived of an emancipatory project in Europe, it was not. I mean, it became colonial once the Zionists went and conquered Palestine, but it wasn't built into, if you will, the DNA. And so, I think, and that is, I say mystical figure because it's not clear really what is the alternative. Homeland, spiritual or cultural Zionism had this homeland idea that it should be a place open to Jews from around the world to come and visit and do pilgrimage, but that it should be sort of enshrined in a state of Jews for Jews. That's where the conflict came in, or the disapproval of it, from Ha'am all the way to Hannah Arendt and even today thinkers. Peter Beinart.
May I go back for a moment to this 1964 translation that you mentioned? And I thought it was really puzzling that those rewritings of the English book happened at the same time. Arendt rewriting into German, the Arabic rewriting into Arabic. Has there been an exchange? Has there been a correspondence or something like that? That's the first part of my question.
Yeah.
The second part is, you said the translation in your reading or in the self-account of Hamas is an original intervention, and since Arendt is so much thinking thinking with the language. I was wondering whether you came across moments where this intervention has is interesting in a way how maybe the Arabic translation would be inspired or even forced to connect this to traditions of thought, as Arendt did in her termings. And an additional question to that is, or a related question to that is, if one thinks of expressions like the miracle of new beginning, which is kind of a core term in this book on revolution, a metaphor that needs to be read and reinterpreted every time you read it, because it's not, what does that mean? So, what did the Arabic translation do with metaphors like that? And is there parts of that translation that now, or those concepts, which are not concepts, but concepts and metaphors very often, do you see them coming up again in current discussions?
I don't, but it's a great question.
And if so, has this, if we talk about re-inspiration in both directions,
Re-energizing, yeah.
how would they,
Yeah.
how would those terms or concepts be,
That's right, yeah.
put in a new context and given
I think that requires an enormous investment, micro-historic investment in the reception of not
It's probably
just,
just a
not,
coincidence you come across it and here it is as a quote.
sorry, what,
No, I said often, you cannot cover the whole ground. I was wondering whether you came across something like that.
it's a similar question Nama Rockham gave me at Chicago.
I'm not surprised.
And but she put and what she said, I said, I haven't really done a close rereading. What I should do if I, have more time, I should do a retranslation of sorts of Hamad's translation back into English and then compare that translation to Hannah Arendt's original. It's one option. The other option would be to compare Atallah al-Wahhab's translation, which is more recent, the one that I briefly mentioned. That is different. I have a feeling I don't know Atallah al-Wahhab, I think he's also Palestinian. I had no idea that this book had already been translated. So, and I looked online, so it's not a thorough research, but I looked at the Alexandria Library and through Arabic search engines. These are not in circulation much. I was surprised that Fusul should discover it, and the frontispiece was from Darul Kutub, so it's not taken from a bookseller down on Kandahar. It was taken from the National Library. In 1990, Darul Saki did two translations, one on revolution and one Origin of Totalitarianism. Both quickly went out of print. I could not. I wrote to the publisher Darul Saki, both in London and Lebanon. It's out of print. I hear it was a rather liberal translation by a journalist. It was not actually a professional translation. So if I could take an enigmatic or a passage that epitomizes that new beginning, that idea, and compare one translation's rendering into Arabic with the other, I could then maybe come up with some sort of form of idea. But it's not. I cannot ever make a claim that any of these translations have been widely read. I think I have to excuse myself of that claim. Much though I hope that this stuff sort of circulates, but I don't have the legs to prove sort of to do a proper reception analysis. It could be sort of sporadic, episodic, but I don't think I can do what would definitely be a great project in the way that concepts travel. My sense is that Heidi Hamad has none of his footnotes sort of go something like, oh, here she quotes Aristotle, and this is what Farabi says. So there's no, the footnotes are not at the level of my tradition versus your tradition. The Arabic concept of ethics versus the Greek tradition that she invokes. Is this something that you might? I think he stuck with the Western canon, and I think he was educated in Cambridge. He was English language throughout his education.
I just assume if you take an expression like the miracle of new beginning, depending which words you choose in Arabic, you kind of connect to a tradition of using those terms.
That's true. You could have.
And so that starts to resonate with the language you translate into.
That's right.
And starts a conversation with the tradition of that term.
So what I can. So my hypothesis would be that the translation. Arabic word for miracle by a Nasserist would be one, whereas perhaps somebody else who's got more of a religious training might have more Quranic resonances. Is this some way you can?
For example, and I mean this would be also a formulation where I would assume this is like the banality of evil or other terms that kind of travel also through, people who even haven't read the book but maybe heard that expression and thought, wow, this really captures something I can relate to. Or
banality of evil is, may I? This is something I had to take out even on this paper for you. It's going to be published hopefully with Hannah Arendt on net. Is Taib Saleh's who's a famous, wonderful novelist, just passed away a few years ago, author of Seasons of Migration to the North, apparently funded by the CIA. He has a long sort of serialized commentary on banality of evil, in which he interlays his own experience of arriving in London as a Sudanese novelist in 1950. And he has one of his 9 articles in an Egyptian journal, the Marifa, was on a large passage of these on banality. I can't remember how he translated it as samaja. He suggested this word as opposed to that word because that Arabic word is too close to trivialization. Whereas samaja, does that make sense? I've never heard that term before. Samaga?
I wouldn't use that as banality.
What does it? Is it? I think he makes it clear.
It has to do with has sort of connotations of like sort of the annoyance or like sort of petty. It's.
Or maybe he's against that term.
Yeah.
Has another one. Maybe it's the other way around because maybe before him people have used this term samaja, and he's sort of creating this. He's not doing a translation. He's summarizing a plot, as it were. And so he suggests a new term for banality. Certainly this tells us that something is happening to the Arabic language, however small, when things are translated from Arendt, from Benjamin, or from, it's not surprising, but we can maybe collectively piece together or get a student to work on this to search this question. Is there a new vocabulary that emerges? At least theoretically, we can't make any claims of, well, we can.
I wonder if one of the distinctions that is important for Hamad is the values, Arabification, and the tarjuma.
Right.
So here you have a project of
Yes.
the Arabic language as opposed to, you said, writing into a tradition. It's a different kind of way of doing language, not just translation, so to speak, but making something new.
Yeah, I haven't done the sort of linguistic exercise in my article. I would have taken far away from the Nahja. But it's certainly a topic that I think, it's the beginning, this kind of work. I think maybe it's a work for generations. I think if we start opening up questions.
Another example, maybe, or a question that you talked about violence and freedom in revolutionary activities, and you just quoted one of those typical Arendtian formulations, saying it rests in and is secured by the tragedy and in it, and the way how. Yes, so she often has those lists or clusters.
Right.
That address the problem of the relation between violence and revolution and freedom, for example, but not always, or typically not in a totally clear way. Small things like conjunctions and prepositions play a very important role. How she relates those thoughts. And I don't know Arabic, but it would be interesting if there is something, where the two languages coming together really have to make decisions about, about the reading of the English text. This would also be interesting how, what inclination the translation would give to
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Can
in
I
that respect.
just ask a question? This is the place, I think, for me to ask this. I've been wondering for a long time. What about the banality of evil, the German, the original German? As I understand it, the banality of evil is actually Karl Jasper's phrase in correspondence with Arendt. And I read that correspondence in English translation, so I don't know what the German was.
Who is it? Who is it?
And I think there's a whole sort of mini drama there about the fact that that correspondence, which I assume some people here must know about, but in the
Where she told freely about who's at the trial and how they're all from Galicia or Levantine mobs. It was not her finest, no.
But so Jasper's phrase, the banality of evil, what would that be in German?
Banalität des Bösen.
It's the
I
same.
I think so.
But the word for evil would be böse
Yeah.
in German.
I'm more interested in banality.
Banalität.
Yeah.
It's the same term.
There have been some people recently who've been making an argument that banality has different senses in French and English and German, and that but I honestly, I'm not nuanced enough to understand the differences.
Is this in the book that you edited? Men in Dark Times? Sorry, Thinking in Dark Times?
I don't know if it was.
There's one, the second,
Yaron Esrani.
the new life, second life of the Ahmed tribe.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, maybe it's not now, it's not.
I think we have time maybe for one more question, and then we can maybe talk amongst ourselves afterwards, but I know some people might have something they need to get to. Are there any other questions that people are holding on to? I'd just like to thank you again.
Right, thank you.
Aye.